Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Irish potato famine, a disaster so catastrophic that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about how a single crop failure turned an entire nation into a graveyard. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Feel free to turn down the lights, maybe put a fan on for that gentle hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to transport you to 1845 Ireland, where your biggest worry won't be your morning commute, but whether you'll live to see another sunrise. Why you wouldn't survive as an Irish peasant during the potato famine. Picture this. You wake up not to an alarm clock, but to the gnawing pain of an empty stomach that hasn't seen a proper meal in weeks. The year is 1845, and you're living in a one-room stone cottage in rural County Cork, Ireland. Outside, the October morning carries the sweet, sickly smell of rotting potatoes, a scent that will haunt your dreams. Assuming you have the strength left to dream, you are one of Ireland's 8 million people, and like nearly half of them, your entire existence revolves around a single crop. The potato. Not just any potato, mind you, but specifically the Irish lumper. A variety so perfectly adapted to Ireland's soil and climate that it became the foundation of an entire civilization. And now, in the span of just a few weeks, that foundation is crumbling beneath your feet like the blackened, putrid remains of your potato crop. Your day begins before dawn, not by choice, but because hunger is a demanding master. You stumble from the pile of straw that serves as your bed, sharing space with your wife, 3 children, and possibly your elderly parents. The cottage measures roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with walls of unmortared stone and a roof of sod that leaks when it rains. There are no windows, because glass costs money you've never seen, and the single door is often the only source of light. The floor beneath your bare feet is packed earth, cold and damp, mixed with the accumulated filth of daily life. There's no running water, no sewage system, and certainly no bathroom. Your toilet is a hole in the ground behind the cottage, shared with several neighboring families. Privacy is a luxury you've never known. And cleanliness is a concept reserved for the wealthy Protestant landlords who own the land you work. As you step outside, the reality of your situation hits you with the force of a physical blow. Where once stood neat rows of healthy potato plants, now lies acre after acre of blackened, stinking vegetation. The potato blight, caused by a microscopic organism called Phytophthora infestans, has swept across Ireland like a plague, destroying not just this year's crop, but poisoning the soil for future plantings. You know nothing about microscopic organisms or scientific names. All you know is that the potatoes you planted in the spring, the potatoes your family has depended on for generations, have turned to black, foul-smelling mush overnight. The sight is so alien, so completely wrong, that your mind struggles to process it. It's as if the earth itself has decided to reject your existence. But you can't afford to stand and stare. Your family is depending on you, and there might still be salvageable potatoes buried in the ground. You grab the worn wooden spade that represents one of your family's most valuable possessions and begin the grim task of digging through the diseased earth. Your hands, already cracked and bleeding from years of manual labor, quickly become caked with the black, slimy residue of rotted potatoes. The smell is overwhelming, a combination of decay, mold, and something else, something fundamentally wrong that makes your stomach turn. But you keep digging, because finding even a few edible potatoes could mean the difference between life and death for for your youngest child. After 3 hours of back-breaking work, you've managed to salvage perhaps 2 pounds of questionable potatoes from what should have been a winter's supply for your family. These aren't the firm, healthy tubers you're accustomed to. They're soft, discolored, and carry the faint but unmistakable odor of rot. You know that eating them might make your family sick, but not eating them will certainly kill them. By now, the sun has risen fully, and you can see your neighbors engaged in the same desperate search. Mrs. O'Brien, from the cottage next to yours, holds up a potato the size of a child's fist, examining it with the intensity of a jeweler appraising a diamond. It's partially black, but there's still some white flesh visible. She'll take it home, cut away the diseased portions, and boil what remains with some wild nettles if she can find them. The walk back to your cottage feels longer than usual, weighted down not just by your meager harvest, but by the crushing realization that this is only the beginning. You've heard whispers from travelers that the blight has struck all across Ireland. Counties, Cork, Kerry, Galway, Mayo, the entire western half of the country where the poor depend most heavily on potatoes, all reporting the same devastation. Inside your cottage, your wife has already begun the day's other struggle, keeping your children alive. Your youngest, barely 2 years old, cries constantly now, a weak, pitiful sound that pierces your heart. She's hungry, always hungry, but there's nothing to give her. Your wife's breast milk dried up weeks ago, her body unable to produce nourishment when she herself is starving. Your 8-year-old son, normally energetic and curious, sits listlessly in the corner. His eyes have developed that hollow look you're seeing more and more often, the look of a body beginning to consume itself. His legs show the early signs of edema, swelling from malnutrition that makes walking painful. The breakfast you can provide consists of the few salvageable potatoes, boiled in water with whatever edible plants your wife could gather. Wild garlic, if you're lucky, nettles more commonly, sometimes just grass and weeds. The children eat first, always, followed by your wife, and you take whatever remains. Today, that amounts to perhaps half a potato and some bitter green water. As you eat, you try to calculate how long your remaining food might last. The handful of oats you've been saving, the small cache of turnips, the few remaining questionable potatoes. If your family is very careful, if they eat only enough to prevent immediate starvation, you might have food for another week, possibly 2. But what then? Winter is approaching, and with it, the traditional season of hunger, even in good years. The Irish called it the hungry months, the time between when the previous year's potato supply ran out and the new crop was ready to harvest. Except this year, there will be no new crop. You've heard that in some parts of the country, people are surviving on seaweed, gathered from the rocky shores and boiled into a barely digestible paste. Others are eating grass, bark, anything that might fill their stomachs and trick their bodies into thinking they've been fed. The truly desperate are beginning to consume the diseased potatoes despite the risk, preferring the possibility of illness to the certainty of starvation. The British government, which rules Ireland from London, has promised relief. They've established soup kitchens in some of the larger towns, but reaching them requires a journey of many miles, often on foot when you barely have the strength to stand. Even if you could make the journey, the soup they provide is thin gruel, barely more nutritious than the potato water you're already consuming. Moreover, accepting government relief comes with conditions. You must prove your destitution by giving up any small plot of land you might hold, any tools, any possessions that might have value. The relief is designed not just to prevent immediate death, but to force Irish peasants off the land entirely. to clear the way for more profitable sheep farming or cattle grazing. By mid-morning, you must make a decision that will define the rest of your short life. Do you stay and try to survive on what little remains, knowing that each passing day makes survival less likely? Or do you abandon everything you've ever known and join the growing streams of refugees heading toward the ports, hoping to find passage to America or England? If you choose to stay, your days will become an increasingly desperate search for anything edible. You'll learn to identify plants that won't immediately kill you, to catch rats and mice, to compete with your neighbors for scraps that would have been fed to pigs in better times. You'll watch your children grow thinner and weaker, their laughter fading until they lack the energy even to cry. Disease will become your constant companion. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly through populations weakened by hunger. The fever will come first, leaving you delirious and unable to care for your family. Then the dysentery, your body's final desperate attempt to extract nutrition from anything you've consumed, even as it dehydrates and weakens you further. If you choose to leave, you'll join what historians now call the coffin ships. Overcrowded vessels where disease spreads even faster than it does on land. The passage to America costs money you don't have, forcing you to indenture yourself or sell what little remains of your possessions. Many who board these ships never see land again, their bodies committed to the Atlantic Ocean somewhere between Cork and Boston. Those who survive the journey often find that America, while offering more opportunity than Ireland, has little sympathy for Irish Catholics. You'll face discrimination, violence, and working conditions that, while better than starvation, still offer little hope for genuine prosperity. But let's say you're among the stubborn or the hopeless who choose to remain. Your afternoon is spent in increasingly creative attempts to find food. You know that the local workhouse, a grim institution designed to provide the absolute minimum relief while making the experience as unpleasant as possible, might accept your family. But entering the workhouse means separation. Men, women, and children are housed separately, families broken apart in the name of moral discipline. The work itself is deliberately meaningless, designed to discourage all but the truly desperate. You might spend your days breaking stones into smaller stones, or picking apart old rope, fiber by fiber. The food provided is calculated to the exact minimum necessary to prevent immediate death. A thin gruel of corn, meal, and water that leaves you perpetually on the edge of starvation. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to the Irish potato famine. As evening approaches, you've managed to gather perhaps a handful of edible plants and one questionable potato. Your family will eat tonight, but tomorrow the search must begin again. And each day the competition grows fiercer as more families exhaust their reserves. The social fabric of your community is beginning to unravel. Neighbors who once shared tools and helped with harvests now eye each other with suspicion, knowing that anyone who has found food has something worth taking. Stories circulate of families turning against each other, of parents abandoning children they can no longer feed, of desperate souls stealing from the dead. Your evening meal is consumed in silence, each member of your family concentrating on making their small portion last as long as possible. The children have stopped asking for more food, a development that should bring relief, but instead fills you with dread. When children stop asking for food, it means they're beginning to accept that there is no more. As darkness falls, you lie on your bed of straw, listening to your family's breathing, counting each breath as a small victory. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and repeat this same desperate routine, searching for food that becomes scarcer each day, fighting off despair that grows stronger each night. Your wife whispers a prayer, her voice so weak you can barely make out the words. She's praying not for prosperity or happiness, but simply for the strength to survive another day, for her children to wake up tomorrow morning, for death, when it comes, to be swift and merciful. Outside, the October wind carries the sound of other families engaged in their own quiet struggles. A baby crying in the distance, quickly shushed by parents who know that crying uses energy they can't spare. The sound of someone coughing, the wet, persistent cough that signals the beginning of the end. You close your eyes and try to remember what it felt like to go to sleep with a full stomach, to wake up without the immediate panic of wondering where your next meal would come from. The memory seems impossible now, like something from a fairy tale that never really existed. This is your life during the Irish potato famine. Not a single dramatic moment of tragedy, but a slow, grinding diminishment of everything that makes existence bearable. Day after day of increasing desperation, watching your loved ones waste away, while you remain powerless to help them. And this is only the beginning. The famine will last for 7 years, killing over 1 million people and forcing another million to emigrate. Entire villages will disappear, their populations either dead or scattered to the winds. The island, the island of your grandparents and great-grandparents, will cease to exist. You wouldn't survive the Irish potato famine because survival required resources you never had, options that were never available to you, and a government that viewed Irish suffering as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of maintaining the existing order. Your death, when it comes, will be just one among hundreds of thousands, a statistic in a tragedy too large for any individual mind to comprehend. But for tonight, you're still breathing, still hoping, still fighting for one more day of existence in a world that seems determined to erase you entirely. As the weeks turn into months, your body begins to betray you in ways you never imagined possible. The constant hunger has moved beyond mere discomfort into something that feels like a living creature gnawing at your insides. Your stomach has shrunk, but paradoxically, eating the small amounts of food you can find becomes increasingly difficult. Your body has forgotten how to process nourishment properly. Your teeth begin to loosen in your gums, a symptom of scurvy that you don't understand but that makes eating even more challenging. Simple tasks that once required no thought now demand tremendous effort. Lifting a bucket of water leaves you breathless and dizzy. Walking to the nearby field feels like climbing a mountain. The psychological toll proves just as devastating as the physical one. You find yourself obsessing over food in ways that would have seemed impossible during times of plenty. You dream about potatoes, not the rotting black masses that surround you, but the firm, creamy white flesh of healthy tubers. You wake from these dreams with tears on your face, mourning vegetables as if they were lost loved ones. Your relationship with time begins to change. Minutes stretch into hours as you search through diseased fields, hoping against hope to find something, anything, that might be edible. Yet days blur together in a haze of repetitive desperation. You lose track of what day it is, what month, sometimes even what year. The only calendar that matters is the one measured in meals, and by that reckoning, time has nearly stopped. The silence in your cottage grows heavier each night. Conversations that once filled your evenings, stories passed down through generations, songs sung while working, all fade away as your family conserves every ounce of energy for the essential task of staying alive. Even thinking requires calories you can't spare. You begin to notice changes in your neighbors that mirror your own family's decline. Mrs. Murphy's youngest daughter, once a bright, chattering child, now stares blankly at nothing for hours at a time. Old Sean O'Sullivan, who used to regale the village with stories of his youth, hasn't spoken in days. His eyes carry a glassy quality that you're learning to recognize as the look of someone whose body is beginning to shut down. The social hierarchies that once defined your community crumble under the weight of universal suffering. The local schoolmaster, once respected for his education and slightly better circumstances, now begs alongside everyone else. The village priest, traditionally fed by his parishioners' donations, grows as gaunt as his flock. Even some of the Protestant farmers, while better positioned than the Catholic peasants, begin to show the strain of economic collapse. Religion, once a source of comfort and community, becomes complicated by suffering. Some find their faith strengthened, viewing the famine as a test of their devotion. Others begin to question a God who would allow such widespread innocent suffering. Sunday masses become gatherings of the skeletal and desperate, prayers taking on an urgency that borders on desperation. The British authorities, when they appear at all, seem to exist in a completely different reality. They speak of the famine as a temporary inconvenience, a market correction that will ultimately benefit Ireland by forcing its people to become more self-sufficient. They discuss the situation in terms of statistics and economic theory, seemingly unable to comprehend the individual human tragedies playing out in every cottage. Local landlords, many of them absentee English aristocrats who have never set foot in Ireland, continue to demand rent payments even as their tenants literally die of starvation. Evictions become common, families thrown from their homes, not out of cruelty but out of cold business calculation. An empty cottage can be razed, the land converted to more profitable uses. As winter deepens, you realize that survival has become not just about finding food, but about maintaining the will to continue searching for it. Depression settles over your community like a heavy blanket, sapping the energy needed for the daily struggle to live. Some simply lie down and wait for death, too exhausted to fight any longer. You wouldn't survive the Irish potato famine because survival required not just physical endurance, but psychological resilience that few human beings possess. It demanded the ability to watch your children waste away while maintaining hope, to see your entire way of life destroyed while planning for a future that might never come. The biography, Daniel O'Connell and the Political Tragedy of the Famine Years. As the potato blight spread across Ireland in the autumn of 1845, one man stood at the centre of Irish political life, watching his life's work crumble along with the diseased crops. Daniel O'Connell, known throughout Ireland as the Liberator, was 70 years old when the famine began, already weakened by age and decades of political struggle. His story during these catastrophic years reveals not just personal tragedy, but the complete failure of constitutional politics in the face of human catastrophe. O'Connell had spent his entire adult life believing that reason, law and moral persuasion could free Ireland from British oppression. He had achieved what many thought impossible, securing Catholic emancipation in 1829, allowing Irish Catholics to sit in Parliament and hold public office for the first time in over a century. He had built the most sophisticated political machine in Europe, organizing millions of Irish peasants into a peaceful movement for civil rights and eventual independence. But as reports of crop failure poured in from across Ireland in October 1845, O'Connell faced a crisis that would test every principle he had ever held dear. The British government's response to the famine would force him to confront the possibility that everything he had believed about justice, civilization, and the power of moral argument might have been tragically wrong. The first reports reached O'Connell at his estate in Kerry, where he witnessed the devastation firsthand, walking through the blackened fields that had fed his tenants for generations. The old man understood immediately that this was not merely another bad harvest. The scale and completeness of the destruction suggested something unprecedented, a catastrophe that would require unprecedented response. O'Connell's initial reaction was characteristic of his lifelong faith in British institutions. He immediately began drafting letters to government officials in London, providing detailed accounts of the crop failure and requesting emergency relief measures. His correspondence from this period reveals a man still confident that appeals to humanity and reason would move the British government to action. The cry of a nation in distress will surely reach the ears of a Christian government. He wrote to Prime Minister Sir Robert Peel in November 1845. The people of Ireland have always been loyal subjects of the Crown. Surely that loyalty will be rewarded now in our hour of greatest need. But as weeks passed without meaningful response from London, O'Connell's letters began to take on a more desperate tone. He described scenes that haunted him: children with the hollow eyes of starvation, families huddled in cottages with no food and no fuel, entire villages where the only sound was the keening of women mourning their dead. The British government's initial response seemed to confirm O'Connell's faith in gradual reform. Prime Minister Peel, to his credit, recognized the severity of the crisis and took several immediate steps. He imported corn from America, established relief works programs, and set up a scientific commission to study the potato disease. For a brief moment in early 1846, it appeared that O'Connell's decades of building bridges between Ireland and Britain would pay dividends in Ireland's darkest hour. However, these measures proved woefully inadequate. The imported corn was unfamiliar to Irish palates and required processing that most families lacked the equipment to perform. The relief works programs employed only a fraction of those who needed help, and paid wages so low that workers could barely afford the inflated food prices. Most crucially, these programs were designed as temporary measures, expected to last only until the next potato harvest, when that harvest also failed completely in 1846. O'Connell realized he was witnessing not just a natural disaster, but a fundamental failure of the political system he had spent his life trying to reform. The British government, faced with a crisis requiring massive intervention and expense, chose instead to treat the famine as an opportunity to reshape Irish society according to English economic theories. The election of a new Whig government under Lord John Russell in July 1846 marked the beginning of what would become O'Connell's final political battle. Russell and his advisers, influenced by the economic theory of laissez-faire, believed that government intervention in the economy was not only wrong but ultimately harmful. They viewed the famine as a natural correction that would force Ireland to abandon its primitive dependence on potatoes and develop a more modern agricultural system. Charles Trevelyan, the Assistant Secretary to the Treasury who oversaw famine relief, articulated this position with chilling clarity. "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson," he wrote. "The calamity must not be too much mitigated." The policy that emerged from such thinking prioritized ideological purity over human life, treating mass starvation as an acceptable cost of economic modernization. O'Connell's response to these policies marked a dramatic shift in his political approach. For the first time in his career, the man who had built his reputation on peaceful constitutional methods began to speak of British rule in Ireland as fundamentally illegitimate. His speeches in Parliament during 1846 and 1847 carried a fury and desperation that shocked even his longtime supporters. "You are murdering the Irish people," he declared in the House of Commons in February 1847, his voice shaking with emotion. "You speak of political economy while children starve in the streets of Cork and Galway. You debate fiscal responsibility while entire families die for want of bread. What good are your precious theories when they are written in Irish blood? These speeches cost O'Connell dearly. His health, never strong in recent years, deteriorated rapidly under the stress of watching his people die while fighting what seemed to be a hopeless political battle. Friends noted that he appeared to age years in the span of months. His famous oratorical powers diminished by exhaustion and despair. More damaging to his spirit than physical decline was the growing criticism from younger Irish nationalists, who argued that O'Connell's commitment to peaceful methods had proven catastrophically naive, led by figures like John Mitchell and Thomas Francis Meagher. A new generation of Irish activists began to argue that British rule in Ireland was inherently genocidal, that only violent resistance could save the Irish people from extermination. The debate came to a head in early 1847, when Mitchell published a series of articles arguing that the famine was not a natural disaster but a deliberate act of genocide by the British government. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, Mitchell wrote, but the English created the famine. He called for armed resistance, arguing that O'Connell's constitutional methods had not only failed but had actually made the situation worse by giving the British government a veneer of legitimacy for their genocidal policies. O'Connell's response revealed the tragic dilemma that consumed his final years. He could not deny that constitutional methods had failed to save his people, yet he remained convinced that violence would only bring greater suffering. "I will not purchase Irish freedom with Irish blood," he declared, even as that blood was being spilled by starvation rather than warfare. The strain of this impossible position finally broke O'Connell's health completely. In early 1847, doctors advised him to travel to a warmer climate, hoping that rest might restore his strength. But O'Connell knew he was dying, and he was determined to use his final months for one last appeal to European conscience. His journey to Rome became a kind of political pilgrimage, stops along the way providing opportunities for speeches. That would be his final testimony to the world about what was happening in Ireland. In London, Paris, and eventually Rome, O'Connell described scenes of mass starvation occurring in the heart of the world's most powerful empire, challenging European assumptions about British civilization and progress. Please leave a comment below letting us know what historical topic you'd like us to explore next, or just check in and let us know how you're doing. Thank you for being such an important part of our little corner of the internet. "I have seen sights that will haunt me to my grave," he told a gathering of European liberals in Paris. Mothers holding their dead children, unwilling to believe that life has fled. Men so weakened by hunger that they cannot dig graves for their families. Villages where the only movement comes from rats feeding on the unburied dead. This is happening not in some distant barbarous land, but in Ireland, part of the United Kingdom, ruled by the Parliament in which I sit. But even as O'Connell spoke, news from Ireland grew worse. The winter of 1847 brought epidemic diseases that spread rapidly through populations weakened by malnutrition. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery killed hundreds of thousands who had survived the starvation. Entire regions of Western Ireland became virtually uninhabitable, their populations dead or fled. O'Connell received these reports in Rome, where he had gone to seek an audience with Pope Pius IX. The meeting between the dying Irish leader and the Pope became one of the most poignant moments of the entire famine period. O'Connell, once the most powerful voice in Irish politics, was reduced to begging for papal intervention on behalf of his starving people. The Pope, moved by O'Connell's condition and his descriptions of Irish suffering, agreed to issue an encyclical calling for international aid for Ireland. But by the time the papal letter was published, O'Connell was dead. his body finally succumbing to the stress and heartbreak of watching his life's work prove insufficient to save his people. Daniel O'Connell died in Genoa on May 15, 1847, with the famine still raging in Ireland. His death marked not just the end of a remarkable individual life, but the end of an entire approach to Irish politics. The faith in constitutional methods, in the possibility of reforming British rule rather than ending it, died with him. His body was returned to Ireland for burial, the funeral procession providing one of the few moments of unity during those dark years. Hundreds of thousands of people, many of them weakened by hunger, lined the roads to pay their respects to the man who had spent his life fighting for their rights. But the crowds were noticeably smaller than those that had gathered for O'Connell's political rallies in better times. Death and emigration had thinned the ranks of his supporters. The legacy of O'Connell's final years would shape Irish politics for generations. His failure to prevent or significantly mitigate the famine convinced many Irish people that constitutional politics was inadequate to protect Irish interests. The generation that came of age during the famine would turn to more radical methods, ultimately leading to the armed uprising of 1916 and the eventual establishment of Irish independence. But O'Connell's tragedy was not just political but deeply personal. He had genuinely believed that reason and moral argument could triumph over prejudice and economic interest. He had spent decades building relationships with British politicians, convinced that they could be persuaded to treat Ireland with justice and humanity. The famine forced him to confront the possibility that such faith had been naive, that the British government was simply incapable of viewing Irish lives as equal to English ones. His final letters reveal a man struggling to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming evidence that his life's work had been based on false assumptions. "I begin to fear," he wrote to his son in March 1847, "that nothing but the complete separation of Ireland from England will ever secure justice for our people. But I am too old to change my methods, and perhaps too tired to learn new ones." The story of Daniel O'Connell during the famine years illustrates the broader tragedy of Irish political leadership during this period. The men who might have provided alternatives to British policy were either constrained by their commitment to constitutional methods, like O'Connell, or marginalized by their advocacy of violent resistance. The result was a political vacuum at precisely the moment when strong, unified leadership might have saved hundreds of thousands of lives. O'Connell's death also marked the end of the last realistic hope for a negotiated solution to the Irish question within the British system. His unique combination of legal brilliance, political organization, and moral authority had made him the one Irish leader whom British politicians felt compelled to take seriously. With his death, the path toward eventual violent confrontation became almost inevitable. The famine continued for 3 more years after O'Connell's death, ultimately killing over 1 million people and forcing another million to emigrate. The Ireland that emerged from this catastrophe was fundamentally different from the one O'Connell had known. More bitter, more radical, and ultimately less willing to trust in the good intentions of British rule. The final months of O'Connell's life were marked by a profound sense of personal failure that went beyond mere political disappointment. In private letters to his family, he expressed a deep spiritual crisis that accompanied his physical decline. The man who had once proclaimed that no political change is worth the shedding of a single drop of human blood was forced to watch as hundreds of thousands died under policies he had been powerless to change. His correspondence from Rome reveals a man grappling with the possibility that his entire life's philosophy had been not just wrong, but actively harmful to his people. Perhaps, he wrote to his daughter Ellen in April 1847, My efforts to work within their system gave them the cover they needed to claim legitimacy for their cruelty. Perhaps every speech I made in their parliament, every law I helped them pass, only made it easier for them to sleep at night while Ireland starved. This self-doubt was particularly painful because O'Connell had genuinely believed in the possibility of British redemption. Unlike many Irish Catholics who viewed English rule as fundamentally alien and oppressive, O'Connell had seen himself as helping to fulfill Britain's own highest ideals. He had quoted British philosophers, cited British legal precedents, and appealed to British concepts of justice and fair play. The famine forced him to confront the possibility that these ideals were merely rhetorical flourishes, window dressing for a system based on exploitation and indifference. The reports that reached him in his final weeks painted a picture of social collapse that went far beyond anything he had imagined possible. Entire counties in Western Ireland had been effectively depopulated. Their surviving inhabitants fled to workhouses or emigrant ships. The landscape itself bore the scars of catastrophe, abandoned cottages already beginning to crumble, untilled fields reverting to wilderness, roads empty of all traffic except funeral processions and refugee columns. Most disturbing to O'Connell were the reports of social breakdown within Irish communities themselves. Families that had maintained bonds across generations were torn apart by the impossible choices imposed by starvation. Parents abandoned children they could not feed, hoping that orphaned youngsters might qualify for institutional relief denied to intact families. Neighbors who had shared tools and labor for decades turned against each other in competition for scarce resources. The Catholic Church, which had been O'Connell's most reliable institutional ally throughout his career, was itself struggling to maintain coherence in the face of catastrophe. Priests, dependent on their parishioners for support, were starving alongside their flocks. Many parish churches closed simply because there were too few living congregants to justify keeping them open. The elaborate network of religious and social organizations that O'Connell had helped build over decades was crumbling under the weight of universal destitution. Even more painful for O'Connell was the growing evidence that his faith in gradual progress had actively hindered more effective responses to the crisis. The constitutional movement he had built was designed for long-term political change, not emergency response. The organizational skills and loyalties he had cultivated were useless when the immediate need was food, not votes. Young radicals like John Mitchell argued that O'Connell's success in channeling Irish discontent into peaceful political activity had actually made the famine worse by preventing the kind of violent uprising that might have forced the British government to take Irish suffering seriously. The liberator, Mitchell, wrote bitterly, taught the Irish people to believe in British justice, and that belief has killed them by the hundreds of thousands. O'Connell's final public appearances in Rome were painful spectacles that revealed the physical and psychological toll of watching his life's work prove inadequate to the greatest crisis in Irish history. European observers noted his trembling hands, his difficulty speaking for extended periods, and most significantly, his apparent inability to offer concrete solutions to the ongoing catastrophe. When Pope Pius IX asked him directly what the Church could do to help Ireland, O'Connell could only weep and beg for prayers. The man who had once commanded audiences of hundreds of thousands, who had built political organizations spanning continents, was reduced to pleading for divine intervention because human institutions had proven so completely inadequate. His death in Genoa came almost as a relief to those who had watched his decline. Friends noted that his final words were not political slogans or inspiring calls to action, but simple prayers for the forgiveness of his failures. He died believing that his commitment to constitutional methods had not only failed to save Ireland, but had perhaps made the tragedy worse by encouraging false hopes in British benevolence. The funeral procession that carried his body back to Ireland became a kind of national penance, a public acknowledgement that the path he had chosen had led to catastrophe. Yet even as they mourned him, many Irish people recognized that O'Connell's failure was not personal but systemic, that no individual could have overcome the combination of natural disaster and political indifference that created the famine. In the end, Daniel O'Connell's story during the famine years serves as a tragic illustration of the limitations of individual greatness in the face of systemic indifference. He had been the right man for earlier struggles, but the famine required responses that his political philosophy simply could not provide. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the end of an era of Irish history, and the beginning of a more radical phase that would ultimately lead to independence, but only after decades of further suffering and conflict. The mystery, the coffin ships, and the archaeology of desperation. In the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, scattered across the seafloor between Ireland and North America, lie the bones of ships that carried the hopes and desperation of a dying nation. These vessels, known to history as the coffin ships, represent one of the most haunting mysteries of the Irish potato famine, a maritime tragedy that claimed tens of thousands of lives and left archaeological evidence that continues to surface more than 150 years later. The mystery begins not with the ships themselves, but with the impossible mathematics of survival that drove over 1,000,000 Irish people to risk everything on a journey across one of the world's most dangerous stretches of ocean. What could drive entire families to abandon everything they had ever known, to spend their last precious coins on passage aboard vessels that were barely seaworthy, to willingly enter floating prisons where death rates sometimes exceeded 50%? The answer lies in a calculation so grim that it defies modern comprehension. By 1847, staying in Ireland meant certain death for hundreds of thousands of people. The British government's relief efforts had proven utterly inadequate, designed more to satisfy political ideology than to save lives. The workhouses were overcrowded death traps where disease spread faster than on the most pestilent ship. The choice was not between safety and danger, but between certain death on land and possible survival across the ocean. The archaeological record of this desperate exodus begins in the Irish ports themselves, where recent excavations have uncovered the physical evidence of mass departure. In Cork Harbour, underwater archaeologists have discovered anchor chains, ship fittings, and personal belongings scattered across the harbour floor, remnants of the chaotic embarkation process that saw thousands of people crammed aboard vessels designed for a fraction of that number. The most poignant discoveries have been the small personal items, the things people carried with them as they fled their homeland forever. Rosary beads carved from Irish bog oak, tiny silver crosses that represented a family's last valuable possession, children's toys whittled from driftwood during the long wait in harbour. Each artifact represents a human story of loss and hope, desperation and faith. But it's the ships themselves that hold the deepest mysteries. The vessels pressed into service for the Irish emigrant trade were often the worst ships available. Ancient cargo haulers and decommissioned military transports that responsible ship owners wouldn't use for valuable cargo. Yet these floating wrecks were deemed acceptable for human beings fleeing starvation. The regulations governing passenger ships were minimal and poorly enforced. British law required 6 feet of space per adult passenger, but gave no guidance on height, ventilation, or sanitation. Ships designed to carry 200 passengers legally might be loaded with 400 or more, with families packed into cargo holds never intended for human habitation. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks tells the story of these voyages in heartbreaking detail. The merchant vessel Stephen Whitney, wrecked off the coast of Ireland in 1847, carried 110 passengers in conditions that defied human dignity. When the ship was excavated in the 1990s, archaeologists found evidence of improvised sleeping areas, makeshift cooking facilities, and sanitation systems that consisted of little more than buckets. The passengers aboard these ships faced challenges that began before they ever left port. Many had already been weakened by months or years of malnutrition, their bodies ill-equipped to handle the stress of ocean travel. The food provided for the journey was often barely edible, consisting of hard biscuits, salt pork so rancid it glowed in the dark, and water stored in barrels that had previously held industrial chemicals. Disease spread through the crowded holds with terrifying speed. Typhus, carried by the body lice that infested the unwashed passengers, could kill dozens within days of the first symptoms appearing. Cholera, dysentery, and smallpox followed close behind, turning passenger compartments into floating morgues where the living were trapped alongside the dead for days at a time. The archaeological record preserves evidence of the desperate measures taken to combat disease and death during these voyages. Medical implements found in shipwrecks include primitive surgical tools, bottles that once contained laudanum and other crude painkillers, and most tragically, children's medicine spoons. Evidence of parents' futile attempts to save their sick children with remedies that were powerless against epidemic disease. Ship manifests from the famine years, preserved in archives across North America, reveal the true scale of mortality at sea. The Elizabeth and Sarah, sailing from County Mayo to Quebec in 1847, began its journey with 276 passengers. By the time it reached quarantine at Grass Isle, 42 people had died at sea, and another 96 were so sick they died within days of landing. But these official records tell only part of the story. Many ships kept deliberately inaccurate manifests to avoid paying penalties for passenger deaths. Captains would record passengers as landed, even if they had died and been buried at sea, making it impossible to determine the true death toll of the coffin ship era. The mystery deepens when we examine the archaeological evidence from Grass Isle, the quarantine station where Irish immigrants were processed before being allowed into Canada. Excavations on the island have revealed mass graves containing thousands of bodies, many of them showing signs of diseases that would have made the ocean crossing a particular torment. The bones tell stories that no written record could capture. Skeletal remains show evidence of scurvy, malnutrition, and the bone deformation that comes from spending weeks crammed into spaces too small for human bodies. Children's remains are particularly heartbreaking, showing signs of rickets and other diseases of malnutrition that would have made them especially vulnerable to the conditions aboard ship. Perhaps most mysterious are the ships that simply disappeared without a trace. Maritime records from the period show dozens of vessels that left Irish ports loaded with emigrants, but never arrived at their destinations. No wreckage was ever found, no survivors ever rescued, no explanation ever offered for their disappearance. The Maria, sailing from Limerick to New York in 1848 with 180 passengers, simply vanished somewhere in the North Atlantic. The Exmouth, carrying 240 people from Cork to Quebec, was last seen off the coast of Newfoundland before disappearing forever. These ghost ships represent thousands of people whose stories will never be known, whose bones rest in unmarked graves on the ocean floor. Modern oceanographic technology has begun to solve some of these maritime mysteries. Deep-sea exploration has located several coffin shipwrecks, revealing the horrific conditions aboard these vessels in preservation-perfect detail. The cargo holds that served as passenger compartments show evidence of overcrowding that exceeded even the worst contemporary accounts. One wreck, discovered off the Grand Banks in 2003, contained the remains of what appeared to be an entire family huddled together in death, their bodies positioned as if they had been trying to comfort each other during their final moments. The archaeological evidence suggests they died of disease rather than drowning, their bodies already lifeless when the ship went down. The cultural artifacts found in these wrecks provide insights into the passengers' mindset during their final voyage. Religious medallions clutched in skeletal hands suggest that many faced death with faith intact. Family photographs, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, show the importance placed on maintaining connections to loved ones left behind. Children's toys, lovingly carved during the long voyage, speak to parents' desperate attempts to maintain normalcy for their families even in the face of catastrophe. But perhaps the most haunting mystery of the coffin ships is not archaeological but psychological. How did human beings maintain hope in the face of such overwhelming evidence that their journey would end in death? Ship logs and passenger diaries describe people singing Irish songs in the depths of disease-ridden holds, sharing scarce food with strangers, caring for orphaned children whose parents had already died. The answer may lie in the letters the survivors sent back to Ireland, documents that have only recently been systematically studied by historians. These letters, while acknowledging the horrors of the passage, often emphasized the hope and opportunity that awaited those who survived. They became recruiting tools for further emigration, creating a cycle where knowledge of the dangers was balanced by testimonies of ultimate success. Archaeological evidence suggests that passengers prepared for the voyage with a degree of planning that speaks to their determination to survive. Hidden compartments in clothing held family heirlooms and seed money for starting new lives. Secret pockets sewn into petticoats contained addresses of relatives in America, carefully preserved against the possibility that the ship might reach its destination. The tragedy of the coffin ships was not just the massive loss of life, but the waste of human potential that loss represented. Among the passengers who died at sea were teachers, craftsmen, musicians, and storytellers, the cultural leaders of their communities who might have rebuilt Irish society in the New World. Instead, their talents and knowledge died with them in the depths of the Atlantic. Recent DNA analysis of remains found at quarantine stations has begun to reveal the family connections among the dead, showing that entire extended families sometimes perished together during the crossing or shortly after arrival. These genetic studies are helping to solve individual mysteries, connecting names from ship manifests to specific graves, giving identity to people who died as anonymous statistics. The archaeology of the coffin ships continues to yield new discoveries that deepen our understanding of this tragedy. Underwater excavations have found evidence of passengers' attempts to maintain Irish cultural practices during the voyage. Improvised instruments for traditional music, makeshift altars for Catholic worship, even primitive schools where literate passengers taught reading to children during the crossing. These discoveries challenge the traditional narrative of the coffin ships as simply vessels of despair. While the mortality rates were horrific and the conditions unconscionable, the passengers were not merely passive victims. They maintained their humanity, their culture, and their hope even in the face of circumstances designed to strip away all three. The mystery of the coffin ships ultimately centers on this paradox of human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization. The British government and ship owners treated Irish emigrants as cargo, valuable only for the fees they paid and disposable once those fees were collected. Yet the archaeological record shows that even in death, these people maintained their identity as individuals, families, and communities. The ongoing archaeological investigation of this maritime tragedy continues to reveal new layers of meaning and mystery. Each wreck discovered, each artifact recovered, each bone properly identified, adds another piece to the puzzle of how 1,000,000 people made. The desperate choice to risk everything on a journey across the ocean, and how tens of thousands of them found death in the depths of the Atlantic, rather than salvation on distant shores. In the end, the mystery of the coffin ships is not just about maritime disaster or government callousness, but about the fundamental human capacity to maintain hope in the face of hopelessness, to preserve dignity in conditions designed to destroy it, and to choose uncertain death over certain extinction. The archaeological evidence of this choice, scattered across the ocean floor and buried in quarantine stations, stands as testimony to both the depths of human suffering and the heights of human courage. The most recent archaeological discoveries have revealed aspects of the coffin ship experience that previous generations of historians could never have imagined. Advanced underwater robotics have allowed researchers to explore wrecks at depths previously impossible to reach, uncovering evidence of daily life aboard these death ships that challenges many long-held assumptions about the passengers' experiences. One particularly significant discovery came in 2019, when deep-sea archaeologists located the wreck of the Star of the Sea, which had disappeared en route from Sligo to Boston in 1847 with 267 passengers aboard. The ship's cargo hold, preserved in the frigid depths of the North Atlantic, contained a treasure trove of personal artifacts that painted a picture of extraordinary human resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. Among the most poignant finds were improvised musical instruments carved from ship's timbers during the voyage. Passengers had fashioned primitive flutes, fiddles, and suggesting that music remained an essential part of Irish cultural identity, even in the depths of floating prisons. The wood bore the marks of hasty construction, evidence of people creating these instruments during the voyage itself, perhaps as a way of maintaining sanity in conditions that drove many to madness. The wreck also contained evidence of an informal economy that developed among the passengers during the crossing. Makeshift trading posts had been established in the darkest corners of the hold, where people exchanged whatever small valuables they possessed for extra rations of food or water. Tiny ledgers, written in Irish Gaelic on scraps of cloth, recorded these desperate transactions, showing how communities formed and functioned even under the most extreme circumstances. Perhaps most remarkably, the Star of the Sea wreck contained evidence of a functioning school that had operated during the voyage. Slate boards, carved wooden letters, and even primitive textbooks fashioned from ships. Manifest papers showed that some passengers had organized educational activities for the children aboard. One slate, miraculously preserved, contained a child's careful attempts to write the Irish alphabet, each letter formed with the concentration of someone learning to preserve their cultural identity through literacy. Recent forensic analysis of skeletal remains from multiple coffin ship sites has revealed disturbing patterns in the mortality data that suggest the selection process for passengers was more calculated than previously understood. The demographic profile of those who died at sea shows a disproportionate number of elderly people, very young children, and individuals showing signs of pre-existing illness or disability. This pattern suggests that families were making impossible choices about who should attempt the dangerous journey. The healthiest family members were kept in Ireland to tend whatever land or resources remained, while those deemed most likely to die anyway were sent on the coffin ships. In essence, the ships were serving as floating hospices, places where families sent their most vulnerable members, not because they expected them to survive, but because staying in Ireland offered even less hope. The psychological impact of this selection process has left its mark in the archaeological record. Personal letters found in shipwrecks often contain farewell messages that read more like final testaments than travel correspondence. "If God wills that I should not see America," wrote one passenger whose letter was discovered in a bottle recovered from an 1848 wreck, "know that I go to my death willingly, so that you might live. Use what little remains to save yourselves, and do not grieve for me overmuch." Advanced chemical analysis of artifacts recovered from coffin ship sites has also revealed the extent to which passengers were forced to consume materials never intended for human consumption. Residue analysis of cooking pots shows evidence of boiled leather, tree bark, and in some cases, materials that appear to have been scraped from the ship's hull itself. These desperate measures speak to starvation so complete that people were willing to risk poisoning rather than face certain death from hunger. The mystery deepens when examining the religious artifacts found in coffin ship wrecks. While many passengers carried traditional Catholic items like rosaries and holy medals, archaeologists have also discovered evidence of syncretic religious practices that blended Catholicism with much older Irish pagan traditions. Carved wooden figures bearing Christian symbols but displaying distinctly pre-Christian iconography suggest that extreme suffering had awakened spiritual practices that had been dormant for centuries. One particularly enigmatic find came from the wreck of the Bride of Erin, lost off Nova Scotia in 1849. Deep in the ship's hold, archaeologists discovered what appeared to be a shrine constructed from salvaged materials during the voyage. The shrine combined Christian crosses with Celtic spirals and Ogham script, creating a sacred space that drew on both the passengers' Catholic faith and their pre-Christian heritage. The shrine's construction showed evidence of collaboration among passengers from different regions of Ireland, suggesting that shared suffering had broken down traditional local boundaries and created new forms of Irish identity. Counties that had maintained separate cultural traditions for centuries found their people working together to create something entirely new. A hybrid Irish-American identity that would survive even if they did not. The global scope of the coffin ship phenomenon has become clearer through recent archaeological work at destination ports across North America. Excavations at quarantine stations from Quebec to New Orleans have revealed similar patterns of death and cultural preservation, suggesting that the Irish famine created the first truly global refugee crisis of the modern era. At Partridge Island in New Brunswick, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of Irish language schools established by survivors while still in quarantine, showing the determination to preserve linguistic identity even in the immediate aftermath of traumatic ocean crossings. Mass graves at the site contain bodies arranged according to Irish burial customs, with feet pointing west toward Ireland, a final gesture of connection to the homeland they would never see again. The mystery of the coffin ships continues to evolve as new technologies reveal previously hidden aspects of this tragedy. Ground-penetrating radar has located dozens of unmarked graves at North American ports, each one potentially containing the remains of coffin ship passengers who survived the ocean crossing only to die within days of reaching their destination. DNA analysis of these remains is beginning to reconnect scattered families, some of whom were separated during the chaos of embarkation and never reunited. Genetic evidence shows that children who survived the crossing were often cared for by unrelated passengers who had lost their own families, creating new kinship networks forged by shared tragedy rather than blood relationships. The archaeological record of the coffin ships ultimately reveals a story that is both darker and more inspiring than traditional historical accounts suggested, while the mortality rates were even higher than previously believed, and the suffering more systematic than most historians had imagined. The evidence also shows extraordinary acts of human kindness and cultural preservation under conditions designed to destroy both. These discoveries remind us that history's greatest tragedies often reveal both the worst and best of human nature, sometimes within the same individuals, sometimes within the same moments. The mystery of the coffin ships is not just about death and disaster, but about life and hope persisting in the face of circumstances that should have extinguished both. The social elite, a world apart, daily life of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy during the famine, while millions of Irish peasants faced starvation and death during the Great Famine. A small but powerful class of Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords lived in a parallel universe of unprecedented luxury and willful ignorance. These were the descendants of English settlers who had been granted Irish lands through centuries of conquest and colonization, and their daily lives during the famine years reveal a society so disconnected from the suffering around them that it borders on the surreal. Consider the daily routine of Charles Trench, the Earl of Clancarty, whose vast estates in County Galway encompassed thousands of acres where potatoes rotted in the fields, while his tenants died of starvation. On a typical morning in December 1846, as bodies piled up in ditches along his property boundaries, the Earl would wake in his palatial Georgian mansion to a breakfast that could have fed a dozen starving families. The meal, served on china imported from Dresden and eaten with silver cutlery crafted by the finest London silversmiths, typically included fresh salmon from his private fisheries, eggs from his extensive poultry yards, bacon from pigs fed grain that his human tenants could not afford, and exotic fruits shipped from his investments in West Indian plantations. While his tenants scraped bark from trees to make a bitter gruel, the Earl worried about whether his chef had properly prepared the hollandaise sauce for the Eggs Benedict. The Earl's mansion itself was a monument to wealth extracted from the very land where people now lay dying. The grand entrance hall, larger than most peasant cottages, featured marble imported from Italy and portraits of ancestors who had participated in the original conquest of Ireland. The morning room where he took his breakfast overlooked manicured gardens maintained by a staff of 30 gardeners, men whose wages were higher than the annual income of most Irish tenant families. After breakfast, the Earl might review his estate accounts with his land agent, a process that revealed the mathematical precision with which wealth was extracted from misery, despite the crop failures that had devastated his tenants' food supply. The Earl's income from rent remained steady through the early years of the famine. His agents had simply increased the pressure on those tenants who still had resources, while evicting those who could no longer pay. The estate ledgers from this period, preserved in Irish archives, make for chilling reading. They record evictions with the same casual attention to detail as routine maintenance expenses. January 15th, 1847, removed the Flanagan family 7 souls from Cottage No. 47 for non-payment of rent. Cottage to be demolished to prevent reoccupation. Cost of demolition, £2.10. The Flanagan family, like thousands of others, simply disappeared from the records, their fate of no concern to the estate management. What makes these records particularly disturbing is their juxtaposition with expenses for the Earl's comfort and entertainment. The same ledger that records mass evictions also details the £200 spent on new curtains for the drawing room, the £50 paid to a London wine merchant for a single case of vintage champagne, and the £100 fee for a renowned chef brought from Paris to oversee preparations for a Christmas dinner party. The social calendar of the Anglo-Irish elite during the famine years reads like a deliberate mockery of the suffering that surrounded them, while tens of thousands died in 1847. The so-called Black 47, Dublin's fashionable society maintained a schedule of balls, dinner parties, and cultural events that rivaled anything in London or Paris. The social pages of the Dublin Evening Post from this period make no mention of the ongoing catastrophe, instead devoting column inches to descriptions of elaborate gowns, exotic menu items, and the romantic intrigues of the Protestant ascendancy. Lady Catherine Fitzgerald, wife of the Duke of Leinster, hosted what was perhaps the most notorious party of the famine years, a costume ball held at Carton House in February 1847. The theme was medieval Ireland, and guests were encouraged to dress as Celtic warriors and ancient Irish nobility. The irony of Protestant landlords celebrating an imaginary version of Irish culture while presiding over the destruction of the real thing seemed lost on the participants. The party featured a menu designed by French chefs and included dishes that deliberately evoked Irish themes while using ingredients completely inaccessible to actual Irish people. Ancient Celtic salmon was prepared with spices imported from India. Druidic venison came from deer in the Duke's private game preserve, and traditional Irish honey cakes were made with sugar from slave plantations and honey from apiaries, maintained exclusively for the mansion's use. The guest list for this event included many of the most powerful landowners in Ireland, men whose estates were simultaneously experiencing some of the highest mortality rates in the country. They danced and feasted while their tenants died, and contemporary accounts suggest that most genuinely believed they were celebrating Irish culture rather than mocking it. The psychological mechanisms that allowed the Irish elite to maintain their lifestyle while surrounded by mass death are revealed in their private correspondence from the period. Letters between aristocratic families show a remarkable capacity for mental compartmentalization, discussing the famine as if it were a natural phenomenon completely unconnected to their own actions and policies. The potato failure has created quite a difficulty with the lower classes, wrote Lord Ashbrook to his cousin in England. They seem to expect assistance from their betters, though of course encouraging such dependency would only make them more helpless in the long run. One must be firm in these matters, however distressing the temporary consequences might appear. This language of paternalistic concern masked a reality of deliberate exploitation and callous indifference, while claiming to act in the long-term interests of their tenants. Anglo-Irish landlords were actually pursuing policies designed to clear their estates of people altogether, converting farmland to more profitable sheep grazing and cattle farming. The daily routine of these landlords included activities that seemed specifically designed to demonstrate their disconnection from Irish suffering. Fox hunting continued throughout the famine years, with elaborate hunts organized even as starving people scavenged for edible roots in the same fields where well-fed horses chased foxes for sport. The contrast between the energy expended on recreational activities and the refusal to organize relief efforts reveals the moral bankruptcy of the Anglo-Irish system. The domestic arrangements of the great houses provide another window into this world of luxury maintained through suffering. Servants in these establishments, all of whom were Irish, were fed better than most independent farmers. The household staff at Castle Howard, the Earl of Wicklow's estate, consumed meat daily, had access to fresh vegetables from the estate gardens, and received medical care that was unavailable to the broader population. Yet these same servants were required to maintain the fiction that their employers were benevolent patriarchs dealing with an unfortunate natural disaster. They served meals that could have fed villagers while maintaining the silence that allowed their employers to avoid confronting the consequences of their policies. The psychological toll on Irish servants, who watched their own people starve while serving feasts to those responsible for that starvation, can only be imagined. The religious practices of the Anglo-Irish elite during the famine reveal another layer of moral complexity. Most were members of the Church of Ireland, the Protestant established church that served as both a religious institution and a pillar of British rule in Ireland. Sunday services in these churches, conducted in English and following Anglican liturgy, took place in buildings that had often been confiscated from the Catholic Church centuries earlier. The sermons preached in these churches during the famine years have been preserved in church archives, and they provide disturbing insights into how Protestant theology was used to justify indifference to Catholic suffering. Ministers regularly preached that the famine was divine punishment for Irish Catholic superstition and moral failings, that Protestant landlords were God's instruments for reforming Irish society, and that true Christian charity lay not in providing immediate relief, but in forcing the Irish to abandon their primitive ways and embrace modern agricultural practices. One particularly revealing sermon, delivered by the Reverend Dr. Whately at Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin in March 1847, argued that the Almighty has seen fit to use the failure of an imperfect food to wean the Irish people from their excessive dependence upon a single crop. Those who would interfere with this providential correction through indiscriminate charity do not serve God's purpose, but rather delay the moral and agricultural improvement that alone can secure Ireland's future prosperity. This theological framework allowed the Anglo-Irish elite to view their wealth and their tenants, suffering as part of the same divine plan. They were not exploiters but stewards, not oppressors but educators, not the cause of Irish misery but the solution to Irish backwardness. The psychological comfort provided by such beliefs cannot be underestimated in understanding how human beings maintained lives of luxury while surrounded by mass death. The cultural activities of the Anglo-Irish during the famine also reveal their disconnection from Irish reality. While traditional Irish music, poetry, and storytelling died with their practitioners in workhouses and coffin ships, the great houses maintained elaborate entertainments based on romanticized versions of Irish culture that bore no relationship to actual Irish life. Amateur theatricals were particularly popular, with landlord families staging performances of plays about noble Celtic heroes and tragic Irish princesses. These productions, performed in English for audiences who had never learned Irish, presented Ireland as a land of mystical beauty and ancient nobility, a fantasy that allowed the performers to celebrate their connection to Ireland, while ignoring the island that existed outside their estate walls. The libraries in these great houses were filled with romantic literature about Ireland written by English authors who had never visited the country, alongside scholarly works that analyzed Irish character and racial characteristics with the same detachment that naturalists might study exotic animals. The Earl of Ross's library at Birr Castle contained over 200 volumes on Irish history and culture, yet his estate management during the famine showed no evidence that he had learned anything from this reading that might have informed more humane policies toward his tenants. Perhaps most revealing are the diaries and personal papers of Anglo-Irish women during this period. Documents that show how the domestic sphere of the great houses was insulated from the reality of famine, even more completely than the public activities of their menfolk. Lady Arabella Denny's diary from 1847 records daily concerns about household management, social arrangements, and personal relationships that could have been written during any period of peace and prosperity. Cook seems to have difficulty procuring the proper spices for the Christmas pudding, she wrote in December 1847, a year when over 400,000 Irish people died of starvation and disease. I fear we shall have to send to London for the ingredients, though the expense is rather tiresome. The gardener assures me that the hothouse grapes will be ready for New Year's, which is some consolation. These women organized charity balls and subscription drives for famine relief. But their charitable activities were conducted with the same detachment from actual Irish suffering that characterized all Anglo-Irish engagement with the crisis. They raised money for soup kitchens they never visited, organized clothing drives for people they never met, and congratulated themselves on their benevolence, while maintaining lifestyles that were directly funded by the system that created the suffering they claimed to address. The children of the Anglo-Irish elite were perhaps the most tragic figures in this moral landscape. Raised in luxury while being taught that this luxury was both deserved and beneficial to those who provided it. Their education included lessons about their responsibility as the civilizing influence in Ireland, their duty to uplift the backward Irish through firm but benevolent rule. Young Charles Trench, heir to the Earl of Clancarty's estates, was tutored by Oxford-educated scholars who taught him that his family's wealth was a trust from God, that his Irish tenants were childlike beings who required paternal guidance, and that any softening of estate discipline would ultimately harm those it was intended to help. At age 16, in 1848, he wrote an essay for his tutor, arguing that the recent troubles in Ireland proved the necessity for strong guidance from the educated classes, as the native population lacks the moral development necessary for self-governance. This education system ensured that the moral blindness of the Anglo-Irish elite would continue across generations, that young people raised in comfort would grow up believing that their comfort was not just deserved, but actually beneficial to those who provided it through their suffering. The daily lives of the Anglo-Irish elite during the famine years thus represent more than mere indifference to suffering. They represent a complete moral and intellectual system designed to make such indifference not just possible, but virtuous. These were not people who ignored suffering despite their moral beliefs, but people whose moral beliefs made suffering invisible to them, who had created a worldview in which their luxury and their tenants' death were both expressions of divine will and natural law. As the famine years drew to a close, the Anglo-Irish elite emerged not chastened by the tragedy they had presided over, but convinced that their firm management had successfully guided Ireland through a difficult period. They had maintained order, preserved property rights, and prevented the kind of revolutionary upheaval that had shaken other parts of Europe in 1848. From their perspective, the system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. The transformation of Ireland from a country of 8 million people to one of 6 million, the emptying of entire counties through death and emigration, the destruction of Irish language and culture. All of this was viewed not as tragedy, but as progress, the inevitable result of bringing modern civilization to a backward corner of Europe. This moral blindness would persist well beyond the famine years, shaping Anglo-Irish attitudes toward Ireland through the remainder of the 19th century and into the 20th. The daily lives of comfort and cultural refinement that the Anglo-Irish maintained during the famine became the template for their continued rule over Ireland, a rule that was finally ended not by moral awakening, but by armed rebellion and political revolution. The legacy of those comfortable drawing rooms and elegant dinner parties, of fox hunts conducted while people starved and charity balls organized while families were evicted, can be traced through the bitter history of Irish-British relations down to the present day. The famine years revealed not just the capacity for human suffering, but the capacity for human beings to create elaborate justifications for ignoring that suffering when acknowledging it would require changing comfortable arrangements. And in that revelation, perhaps, lies a lesson that extends far beyond the specific tragedy of 19th century Ireland. a warning about how privilege insulates itself from its consequences, how power creates its own moral universe, and how human beings can learn to sleep peacefully in comfortable beds, even while surrounded by the sounds of others dying in the cold. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed, unlike the people we just learned about. Sleep well,